So, hello and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the Fairwork Berlin talk series, Conflict and Change in the Global Platform Economy. My name is Mira Wallis and I'm a researcher at the Institute for European Ethnology and the Berlin Institute for Migration Research at Humboldt University Berlin. And I am part of the organizing team of the Fairwork Winter School, which we are officially opening with this event. Let me also mention briefly that with this event, we are also simultaneously opening at our two institutions at Humboldt University a laboratory on the economies, cultures, and politics of computational infrastructures, which aims at an international interdisciplinary cooperation beyond the university to investigate the significant role of these infrastructures for the transformation of the present. And we are also very happy to stay in exchange for this. But now to this event. So during this winter school, researchers, students, and activists from the International Fair Work Network and beyond will meet here in Berlin at the co-working space 1 at the Technical University and digitally in order to discuss the future of platform labor, alternative visions to shape the platform economy, and concrete steps to implement fair working conditions in the sector. And as part of the Winter School program, we will host a series of open panel discussions that will be streamed online. And this is starting with this event today. During these 3 events, a series of experts will discuss the work of the Fair Work Project in different countries and contexts. So we will talk about the challenges of labor regulation in the platform economy, as well as potential interventions to reinvent a fairer platform economy. And originally, we were planning to have this panel tonight in person here at TU Berlin and have it filmed and streamed online. Unfortunately, due to the rise of COVID numbers here in Germany and travel restrictions for some of our international participants, we had to move the panel completely online. But I'm very happy that this online format allows us to still welcome our speakers from India, Chile, Serbia, and UK on this panel, and that the other speakers made it to Berlin safely. So also welcome to all of you, as well as the participants of the Winter School, coming from Ukraine, Austria, UK, Ecuador, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and Germany, who are sitting just next door, actually just behind me at the co-working space 1 here at TU Berlin, and they will see this event live streamed. The Fair Work Winter School is a collaborative effort and organized by members of Fair Work Germany, Humboldt University Berlin, Technical University Berlin, University of Oxford, and the Berlin Social Science Center. And I would like to thank the Berlin University Alliance, who is financing this event, as well as Professor Jan Kratzer from the Center for Entrepreneurship here at TU for hosting us. And a special thanks also to Mark Graham, Manuela Bujagiev, Maren Borkert, and Jan Kratzer, who initiated this collaboration and brought it to success. And I would now like to give a warm welcome to Funda Ustek-Spilda, the chair of tonight's first event on the fairness in the platform economy. Funda is a postdoctoral researcher and project manager at Fairwork, based at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Oxford and a master's degree in comparative social policy. And before joining Fairwork, she held postdoctoral researcher positions at Goldsmiths, University of London, and the London School of Economics. And her research focus are issues of data justice, fairness, and ethics in emerging technologies with focus on labor, gender, and migration. Thank you, Funda, for chairing tonight's session. I hand it over to you, and I wish all of you here at TU and online an exciting evening.
Thank you very much, Mira, for the introduction and also opening the panel tonight. Hello, everyone. We have a fantastic range of speakers today. All will present our Fair Work activities across the world. I would like to briefly present them to you, and then we will do a very, very brief introduction to Fair Work, and then we'll have the round of talks, and we look forward to receiving any comments or questions you might have from the chat, where we will be closely monitoring any kind of feedback from you. So in the run of events today, our first speaker is going to be Henry Chavez. Henry is a researcher and a professor at Flaxo at the Catholic University of Ecuador. He holds a PhD from the École des Hautes Études Sciences sociales in Paris, France. His background is on economics, political, and social sciences with a focus on social studies of science, technology, innovation, global studies, anthropology of world systems, international relations and economic cycles, international analysis of public policies, migration processes, international circulation of elites and knowledge, collaborative economy, circular economy, responsible production and consumption, and new information and communication technologies. Henry has extensive experience as a consultant for the private and public sector, as well as for local organizations, NGOs, and international organizations. He is interested in social and economic research, consulting, technological innovation, and university teaching in multicultural and multidisciplinary environments. Henry today will introduce our first principle, fair pay, to us. The second principle, fair conditions, is going to be introduced by Arturo Arriagada. Arturo is the principal investigator for the Fairwork Chile project. He is an associate professor of communications at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, where he conducts research at the intersection of media, technology, and society. He also is the director of social media culture, a research laboratory based at the School of Communications and Journalism at UAI that studies the role of social media and platforms in social and economic life. Arturo's particular areas of interest include social media and labor, social media and political communication, platform economy, and promotional culture. His work has been published in the Journal of Communication, Journal of Cultural Economy, Online Information Review, International Journal of Communication, International Journal of Press and Politics, amongst others. For the Fairwork project, Arturo develops and leads the research strategy in Chile. This includes adapting the Fairwork principles, interviewing workers and platform executives, analyzing the evidence, and developing platform scores and disseminating results. For principle 3, we have, for fair contracts, we have Branka Anđelković. Branka is the principal investigator for the Fairwork Serbia project. She is also the co-founder and program director of the Public Policy Research Center in Belgrade. Her research interests focus on labor markets and non-standard forms of employment in the context of the knowledge-based economy and digital transformation. Branka is the lead author and editor of 7 pioneering studies about the platform economy and platform-mediated work in Serbia, including GigMeter, which presents data about remote workers on global online platforms from Serbia and other Southeast European countries in terms of gender, income, and occupations. For the fourth principle, fair management, we will have Oğuz Alyanak. Oğuz Alyanak is a cultural anthropologist whose research spans labor migration, urban studies, religion, and masculinity. For his dissertation research, he studied the Turkish community in Strasbourg, focusing on men's night lives and exploring the moral tenets of male socialization primarily in 3 domains: work, home, and the outside. As part of his research, he worked at a doner kebab shop and socialized with Turkish men in their workspaces and after work in their homes, mosque associations, coffee houses, and migrant-populated neighborhoods, as well as their automobiles, joining his interlocutors for car rides to various venues in Strasbourg and its German neighbor Kiel and other cities in Franco-German borderland. He has also collaborated with a Strasbourg-based documentarist to produce an ethnographic documentary on migrant socialization in Königshofen, aka Quartier Istanbul, a neighborhood in Strasbourg. He's currently working on a book manuscript and academic articles based on this research. Following his PhD, Oğuz moved to Germany as a Volkswagen Stiftung postdoctoral fellow at the University of Göttingen. Starting in April 2021, he has taken a postdoctoral researcher position at the Fairwork project, joining a team of scholars to explore working conditions in the platform work and the gig economy in Germany. He is also a visiting researcher of the Globalization Work and Production Research Group at the Berlin Social Science Center. For the last principle, fair representation, we will have Mounika Neerukonda. Mounika is a research assistant at the Fairwork Foundation in India. She is also a student of the Integrated Masters of Technology program at the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, IIITB. Her research interests include collective action in the gig economy, disability studies, and gender studies. She recently co-authored various papers which are all available on the Fairwork website. And for the Fairwork project, Mounika is gathering evidence about platform work conditions in India and analyzing primary data. I welcome all of the speakers that will join us tonight. If you allow me, I will do a very, very brief introduction of our principles for our audience with a few slides and also Fairwork in general. And then we will start with the Fairwork representation first. Even though it is listed as our fifth principle, we will actually start from the east to the west so that our colleagues that are watching us and are joining us tonight from very late in the evening can also participate as much as possible. So just sharing my slides now. So Fairwork is first thing to suggest is that we are joining here with 5 speakers tonight, but Fairwork is actually a very large and growing international network of researchers. We can't have done this and have come so far without the input and hard work of our colleagues everywhere. Currently, we are in nearly 26 countries and are present in over 5 continents. Our collaborators range from universities, research institutes, to various departments. Fairwork is funded generously by various public and private public-private corporations, including but not limited to the GIZ, Ford Foundation, Berlin University Alliance, ECRC, and ERC. At Fairwork, we believe that the change in the gig economy is possible, and the poor working conditions does not need to be become the standards that are accepted. So, in order to change this, we work with platforms, policymakers in government, gig workers, and organized labor, as well as the consumers. We have developed 5 principles for Fairwork. For location-based platforms or geographically tethered platforms where the work needs to happen in the place where the workers work, we have fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. And today's talks will be mainly about the location-based platform economy. We also have developed principles for online work, which follow similarly fair pay, fair conditions, contracts, management, and representation, but the benchmarks are different. Our data collection methods include desk research, interviewing workers and managers, and then putting them all together in a rigorous peer-reviewed process. And afterwards, we score platforms. We give them points as long as they meet the thresholds and the conditions of our principles. And a platform can get a maximum possible Fairwork score of 10 out of 10. Some scoring examples can be seen here, from Germany scores in 2020 to Ecuador scores in 2021. And finally, as a final note, I'd like to draw your attention to the Fairwork Pledge campaign. We invite organizations, including universities, schools, businesses, and charities, to show their support for fair work practices in the gig economy by supporting the Fairwork Pledge. To find more about it, you can go to fair.work/pledge. That was my very brief presentation. And now I will give the floor to Henry Chavez, to start our talk series today by his introduction of I actually announced, sorry, Henry, I actually will give the floor to Mounika first so that we start from 5 to 1. Really apologies, for fair representation. Thank you, Mounika.
Thank you, Funda. I will attempt to share my slides. Just give me a minute. Oh, there you go. Okay, so I will be briefly talking about fair representation, how gig workers in India are organizing. So as Funda mentioned, fair representation is about platforms recognizing collective bodies of workers and acknowledging them and meaningfully negotiating with a collective body of workers, basically listening to a bunch of workers about what their concerns are. And unfortunately, I have to start off on a rather negative note that in India, we haven't seen any platform willing to formally come forward and issue this formal policy of willingness to recognize any collective body of workers. But if we sort of step back and look at the kind of resistance efforts that workers have been making, we've seen a gradual increase in the kind of organization efforts that workers have been making in India here. So one form of this is localized resistance efforts. So I think especially after the onset of the pandemic, our data from speaking to workers across sectors shows a general increased awareness about collective bodies that exist, unions that exist, collective action, interest in collective action, and also a more frequent localized small strikes. So these are, to sort of basically very briefly explain them, these are very small scale strikes that happen in a particular area within a city with about less than 100 workers, and they're usually organized within themselves. They're very informal in nature, and they organize within themselves through WhatsApp or Telegram groups. And here I have a quote from one of the Dunzo rider in Bangalore that we interviewed in 2021. Dunzo, again, is a hyperlocal delivery platform that couriers anything that you want from across the city. And after the onset of the pandemic, Dunzo was deemed as an essential service because of the groceries and the kind of other essential services that they deliver. But since, and a lot of workers actually turned to platforms like Dunzo and Swiggy to make a living after losing their jobs during the pandemic. And with this increased fleet size, and here this worker talks about how there are about 50,000 workers that have joined this platform after the onset of the pandemic. But as a way to cope with this increased fleet size, Dunzo decided to slash rate cards and also decrease the number of rides that are allotted per person, which thereby increases the unpaid waiting time that these workers have to spend on these platforms. So here's an instance of one of the Dunzo workers in 2021 participating in a very localized strike that happened in Indiranagar, which is an area in Bangalore, and showing their resistance against some of the actions that the platform has been taking. So these are very informal, area-specific, localized strikes that we're seeing, and we're seeing an increase of them as compared to the year before. We also have formal unions that are coming up over time, which are basically trying to formalize the process of gig worker organizing in India. So a couple of unions in this space have been IFAT and AIGWU, the All India Gig Worker Union, and they have been formed exclusively for gig workers in an attempt to organize and formalize this process a little bit. And over time, we've also seen, again, with the onset of the pandemic, we've also seen an increase in the kind of activities and strikes that these unions have organized and mobilized among workers. So there was the Black Flag Cab March, which was a silent form of protest that IFAT had organized in the city of Hyderabad. And there was also a Swiggy strike that IFAT had organized in the city of Hyderabad, Chennai, and a couple of other southern India cities. And a point to note here was that when the Swiggy strike was organized in August, Swiggy is a food delivery giant here in India, and they had slashed incentives and rate cards after the pandemic. And these guys were protesting it, and there were about 2,000 workers, I think more than 2,000 workers, protesting this in the city of Hyderabad. And it went on for about 26 days, which is the longest strike that gig workers have organized so far. And a significant, a significant thing to note here is that this is the first time that a state government, had to intervene and ask Swiggy and Swiggy's management to come down to the negotiation table to these guys and talk about, what are the next step forwards. Albeit a lot of demands were not met. From IFAT's perspective, this is still a significant step forward to get these guys down to the negotiation table. What we're also seeing now, I think especially in this year, is a rise in online activism. So we're seeing a lot of anonymous handles being created on social media, especially Twitter, and workers acting as sort of whistleblowers in this space, trying to expose with screenshots, and hard evidence as such about what their daily life actually looks like, what is the cost behind actually delivering a meal to you, or transporting you from one place to the other, and what goes behind that app. And it's gained a lot of popularity. A lot of journals and articles have covered this. A lot of media has covered this. And they're also, the way these tweets are drafted, they seem to be addressing consumers. If you look at this tweet, it talks about reaching out to consumers who are also a part of this network, and sort of reaching out to them in hopes of solidarity with the movement that these guys are engaging in. So I'll just end with this slide here. I'll just explain quickly a case study about urban company beauticians that went on strike in October of 2021. And so Urban Company is a home services platform here in India, and they mainly operate in the beauty services platform, and a lot of these workers are women. And on October 8th, over 100 of them went on strike in Gurgaon at the company's headquarters, protesting the increase in commission rates. And I think what actually happened here at this was this particular strike was able to take advantage of the online activism, online conversation that was happening, or that was already happening around gig workers and gig working conditions. And they were also lent support by formal unions like IFAT and AIGWU. They came out in solidarity with them. They helped them draft some of these demands in a more formalized manner. And so what started out as a localized strike took advantage of the online social conversation that was already happening around gig workers. And there were tweets that went viral they were shared about 3,000 times. And there was a lot of, basically, I think briefly, it was a lot of PR damage that was happening to the company as well. And within a week, Urban Company had come down and had met with these workers that were on strike, and had actually met with some of the demands that these guys put forth. So we're yet to see how some of this sort of plays out in practice, how if the changes actually really happen on the ground. But this is the first time that a platform in the gig workspace has come forward and recognize and sort of at least negotiated with a group of workers who were on strike, and met and sort of meaningfully engaged with them on their demands. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that I started off on a rather negative note that no platform is actually willing at the moment, like in so many other countries right now, to recognize a collective body of workers. But on the other side, there is also some cautious optimism, cautious being the key word here, that there is a more awareness among workers and consumers about organizing, and there are more efforts taking place in this space. Thank you.
Give the floor to Oğuz Alyanak, who is going to introduce us fair management and his findings about this principle in the context of Germany, where he conducts a study. Oğuz, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Funda. I hope you can hear me. So thanks a lot. So I'll be talking about the principle of fair management, and I will leave the discussion a bit technical right now, and in the Q&A, I'll try to open it up more, open the German context up more for discussion. Basically, in this principle, fair management, what we're looking at, that the platform does have a due process for decisions that affect workers. So fair management, the gist of it is that the management is responsive, listens to appeals, takes them into consideration, not just basically saying that, yeah, we heard you, but also trying to proactively improve problems or address problems that the workers may be facing. And as we've already mentioned, in each principle, we have two different thresholds. And under each of these thresholds, we expect a number of criteria to be met in order for us to be able to give points to the platforms that we're evaluating here in Germany. So in the context of the first threshold, which has to do with the due process for decisions that affect workers, first of all, we look at whether there is a human representative of the platform. When the worker is dealing with a problem and he or she has to, or they have to reach out to the platform, do they actually get to reach out to someone, or is it just a chat box, it's a simple email where they don't know whom they're interacting with? This is a criteria that many of the platforms, at least on paper, seem to provide, the platforms that we're looking at in Germany. But there are also, in some of the workers' interviews, we have found that some of these workers don't really know who they're working for. They just know it's a name. But for example, one of the workers of interest has interestingly mentioned that she thinks that she's working for a ghost. So a company that she doesn't know whether it physically exists or not, whether there's a headquarters or not, whether there are actual people that are working there or not, whether when she picks up the phone and calls them, she's gonna be talking to someone, or if it's just gonna be an automated machine. So this is the first criteria under 4.1 that we're looking at. Second, we look at the process, how the platforms process the appeals to issues. So for example, if there are problems with payments, if there are problems with low ratings, or if there are problems with deactivation from platforms, we first want to see these things being written in the contracts, as with any of the criteria in these principles, and then we want to see them also in practice as we're evaluating and studying these platforms. So, for example, we know in the case of one delivery platform here in Germany, quite a big one, quite a famous one here, these days especially, that a lot of the workers, when they have issues with their payments, when they expect to receive, let's say 800 or 900 euro for the work that they've done, but they only receive 700, 750, and they don't know where the 150 is, or where they expect tips to be sent at the end of the workday or at the end of the work month, and they don't see the tips trickling in. So what they do is they send an email to the company HR, and they ask, why did I receive less than I was promised to receive? And interestingly, I mean, they get a response, which is good, right? Like they get a response that says, we got your message. And then they get another response saying, ticket closed. And then they don't receive anything back. They don't hear anything back. They have to keep on sending another email after email, and they get the same thing, ticket closed. So there is that communication channel that's open for appeals, but in practice, it's not responding really. It's not doing the thing that it's supposed to do in the first place. The third criteria that we're looking at, under 4.1 in fair management, is that in the case of deactivation, and this often is the case with platforms that are in the ride-hailing business, in case of deactivation, there must be still a channel open for appeals. So if I am, for some reason, as a worker, deactivated from the platform or suspended for a short or longer period of time, I have a right to call them and ask, or send them an email and ask, why? What has happened? Because oftentimes we know platforms, they can deactivate you with just a click without necessarily telling you the reasons why. Some platforms send a number of warnings beforehand, and this is often in the contract. So that's a different practice. But other platforms can deactivate you from your side, no reason. So you have a right as a worker to be able to appeal to the process and ask, what is the reason for this? This we see more and more happening with ride-hailing platforms here in Germany. And finally, in the fourth criterion under 4.1, our first threshold, is that workers do not feel that they're being at disadvantage for raising their concerns. So, for example, I, as a worker, don't feel like I'm going to be risking my job if I feel like something is going wrong and I want to appeal to that process. But we know also, once again, going back to the delivery sector, one of the delivery platforms had their workers organized on Instagram. And on Instagram, they had a very lively community where they were all posting things about things that are going wrong at the workspace so that they could raise awareness. And a couple of days later, the Instagram account got closed. Now, we don't know if this Instagram account got hacked or whether the platform itself made a legal request for the Instagram page to be shut down. We don't know what has happened, but we know that that channel of communication, even though it's not company provided, it's worker provided, basically in this case, the social media channel was shut down. They had another channel, a number 2, and then a number 3. Both of these were also shut down later on. So it feels like the workers, when they're trying to do something to appeal, to respond to conditions that are displeasing, the company, rather than listen to them, is basically shutting these channels down. And that creates also a feeling of being at disadvantage, because we also know that some of the workers that we have talked to here in Germany, when they, first of all, they fear the repercussions of appealing too much. They feel the repercussions of complaining. Sometimes they say that we shouldn't be complaining, we should just do our job. And I ask them, but this is your right to raise awareness about these issues. And at that point they say, but I also fear losing my job. And this should not be an issue that workers have to face. This should not be a fear that workers have to live with. So these are the 4 criteria under the first threshold. In the second threshold, what we're looking at is that the platform provides equity in management process. So basically, we want to make sure that conditions are egalitarian, access to jobs, and the way that you do your job as you're doing your job is done in an egalitarian manner. So what do we mean by that? There are, once again, 4 criteria under this threshold. First of all, we're looking at whether the company has a anti-discrimination policy. So basically, anyone who applies, regardless of their sex, gender, belief, their nationality, their immigration status, regardless of that, as long as they're legal and they have the paperwork to provide that they can work in a country, can they? Oftentimes what we see is, yes, many of these platforms that we're looking at Germany, because the law also demands that some of these policies are implemented, that a lot of these platforms do have that. But in practice, do they actually put it into practice? Or is it just a wording on paper? The second criterion under 4.2 on fair management looks at the barriers to access. So basically anyone, regardless of who they are, where they come from, how they identify themselves with, regardless of all of that, when they want to apply for a job and when they're accessing job markets, do they face any discrepancies in this access? So, for example, a question that we ask is, and gender is one of the lenses that we can clearly see this happening in Germany as well. Is it oftentimes men that are in ride-hailing platforms, that are working for ride-hailing platforms? And is it oftentimes women that are working in domestic care and elderly care sectors? And if that is the case, is that a company policy? And of course, it's not going to be the company is not going to publicly say that this is what we want, but is that an intention that continues to reproduce these systematic injustices? That's one thing that we're looking at in the second criterion under 4.2, threshold 4.2. Number 3 in this threshold is looking at when workers access to work, but they are dealing with a disability, or in the case of women, pregnancy, or parental leave for fathers, is there any policy that is implemented that provides them the right to be able to entertain these things that should be a given in any job environments? Number four, the fourth criterion looks at the algorithms. So basically, when workers are applying for jobs, do they each get to be, are they shown the same number of jobs and the same jobs even when they're applying to these jobs? Or is your access to job based on an algorithm that workers and oftentimes also researchers do not have access to? This is something that we try to get by talking to management. And as you would rightly expect, the management is not always willing to be very transparent about the kinds of algorithms that run, because that is a part of their business model. But this is something that we keep on challenging as we're talking to managers about the different algorithms that open up access to work. And finally, the fifth criterion in fair management is the risk of discrimination against workers that are coming from disadvantaged groups. So, for example, we know, let's say, a platform does a good job in having an anti-discrimination policy and opening access to all workers. That sounds great. But when work itself is being done, when it's being sorted out, when it's basically put in practice, does a worker, just because he or she or they of their identity, of the values that they represent, this could be religious, this could be gender-based, this could be their nationality, this could be what they wear on themselves, is there any discrimination that they face for who they are? And of course, from a critical perspective, you might say, but is it the platform's responsibility to deal with such a systematic issue that's out there, for example, racism or sexism, that is still a prevalent part of any society, including Germany? My answer to that is yes, it is still a platform's responsibility, because we expect change to come through platforms, but also through platforms. So these bigger systematic issues that need to be dealt with also have to be dealt, or at least proactively challenged at the managerial and at the business level as well. So this is what we look at in the context of fair management and how we tackle this principle as we're evaluating the platforms that we are including in our study this year.
Thank you, Oğuz, for the introduction. And without giving any break, I will give the floor to Arturo, who is going to I will give the floor to Branka, who is going to explain us fair contracts and how they pan out in Serbia. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. Just to begin with, I would say that Serbia is an interesting place when it comes to legal landscape. And I'm sure that this country is not exclusive in this regard. There are three platforms that are actually active in Serbia when it comes to ride-hailing platforms, Wolt and Glovo as international ones, and there is a local platform called Cargo. We also have one house cleaning platform. It's a local platform called Uradi Zaradi. And all these four platforms are actually using two dominant forms of contracts in the country. I don't think that I need to remind you what fair contracts are all about under these fair work principles. But just to sum it up, I would say that fair contracts under 3.1 anticipate that platforms must demonstrate that workers are able to understand, agree to and access the conditions of their work at all times, and that they have legal resources in case that the platform or platforms breaches those conditions. Second important point, 3.2, looks into one more important element, and this is the liability of platforms when it comes to damages arising in the course of workers or delivery workers' work. So when we sum this up and look the current legal landscape in Serbia, this is what we have. And I'm going to skip the format, most dominant form of work, which is standard employment in Serbia, as this is not really an interesting point for us tonight. So what we have at hand in Serbia as a legal opportunity for platforms to engage or basically hire delivery workers is the format of self-employment. I think that in most cases you're all familiar with this kind of arrangement, where actually workers are required to establish or register business entity. And this is the case in Serbia as well. So under Serbian legislation, once you're considered as a business entity, you have certain rights that belong to businesses. But on the other side, you don't have any rights that are considered as workers' rights. And these are, there is no annual leave, there is no sick leave, there is no right to unionization or collective action, and there is no maternity or paternity leave. This kind of arrangement is actually used by only one platform in Serbia, and this is Global. Next thing we have is actually a new legal formation, or let's say conceptual framework, that was introduced in March, I think, 2020. Serbia by that time didn't have any other format, let's put it this way, that would actually deal with with different kinds of employment that are not really belonging to the standard employment type of contract. So big change was made in March, as I said, 2020, whereby, according to this new law, there was an introduction of intermediary agency that was put somewhere in between the worker, in this case, delivery person, and platforms, in this case, Glovo, Volt, and Cargo. According to this law, all these people who are hired by employment intermediaries are guaranteed minimum wage, the right to sick leave, the annual leave, as well as safety at work, transportation, and other employment rights, which are still considered as important here in Serbia. Of course, there was a huge debate between, let's say, government and trade unions, because trade unions were asking that the number of possible workers through agencies in a company should be limited to 10%, which means that only 10% of workers could be hired in this way. Of course, this proposal failed. So any business entity in Serbia can actually have all the workers hired in this way. meaning 100% of workers could be hired through employment intermediary. And this is what happens with Glovo, Volt, and Cargo. All these agents or platforms are actually using this modality as their preferred way of doing business when it comes to courier services. On the positive side, let's say that this intermediary employment type or format provides really greater right for workers compared to the previous period when agencies, and in this case we're talking about so-called student agencies, could hire workers only for a short period of time, and that was it. But at this point of time, what we are looking at, and these are downsides of this contractual relationship, and they are the following. First of all, what happens is that hiring people in this way allows really a lot of flexibility and easy termination of contracts, meaning in a minute or 10 minutes if really needs to be executed in this way. Secondly, any agency worker, according to this law, cannot be hired more than 2 years by the same employer under a fixed term contract. So if, for example, Glovo would like to have the same courier working for Glovo in the 3rd year, there needs to be a change of contract between the intermediary and that worker, which is very hard to achieve. And thirdly, also very importantly, is that all responsibility when it comes to workers' rights is on intermediary agencies and on labor inspections. So Glovo, Volt, and Cargo have no any responsibility when it comes to the fairness of contracts and all other stipulations that Fairwork considers important. So here I will conclude with the contractual landscape in Serbia.
Thank you very much, Branka, for that introduction. And before I give the floor to our next speaker, I would like to remind everyone and invite everyone who is following us on YouTube and on live stream or on Twitter to please send your questions to us for the next session of our panel, and our panelists can respond to them. On that note, I give the floor to Arturo, who is going to describe us his findings on fair conditions from his study in Fairwork, Chile.
Thank you, Funda, and thank to the organizer of this event and the people in the audience. Well, in my case, I would like to talk about fair conditions according to the Fairwork Framework. Briefly, this principle refers to the way platforms address the risks workers have doing their activities, including, for example, or the different risks they are exposed to during their activities, including accidents, injuries, the use of harmful materials, crime and violence. Platforms in this case must show that they are aware of these risks and take steps to mitigate them. Also, platform workers are vulnerable to the possibility of losing their income as the result of unexpected or external circumstances, such as sickness or injury, or in the context of a pandemic. Most countries, as we know, maybe provide a social safety net to ensure workers don't experience sudden poverty due to circumstances outside the control. According to this principle, platform workers usually don't qualify for protections such as sick pay because they are independent contractors. No, so in recognition of the fact that most workers are dependent on income from the platform for their livelihood, platforms can achieve this point when we rate their conditions, no, by providing compensation for loss or income due to inability to work. In the context of Chile, let me give you briefly a general background of the gig economy in our country. According to media reports, there are approximately 15,000 app delivery workers in the country and 200,000 ride-hailing workers. The economic effects of the pandemic in the country has increased the number of people who become part of the gig economy, and considering the unemployment rates that reach, for instance, 13% in July 2020, lots of people are moving from formal markets or job markets or labor markets towards the gig economy. No? A recent media article titled as historic the increase in the number of delivery workers, reaching 20% in the case of a food delivery platform and 78% in the case of a hail rating platform in Chile. When we explore risk and fairness, according to the Fairwork methodology, we found that Chilean gig workers understand those risks principally in relation to traffic accidents, for instance, the role that inspectors have taken away their cars, considering they are working illegally most of the time, especially for Uber drivers, for instance. And also they are suffered or they are exposed to robbery, armed robbery. So we found that there's no a clear criteria from platforms to protect their workers. In some cases, platforms only hear the demands of drivers, for instance, that are well qualified by consumers. In the case of drivers that are not in the top of the rankings, according to consumers' ratings, they have no certainty that if they suffer an accident or if they are victim of robbery, they will receive some kind of protection or help by the platform. Also, this idea of fairness is very related to the concept of risk. And as we know, in this economy, workers are how can I say, exposed or dealing with risk daily during their activities. They assume the risk of the activity they are doing. So we found, or I can give you another example in relation to food delivery workers. When they have some kind of or they develop different strategies to deal with risk, especially through groups on WhatsApp, for instance, to protect each other when they are working. For instance, I have a description here of one of the workers we interviewed for our 2020 report in Chile. She's a Venezuelan worker who lives in the country since a couple of years, and she explained how the platform does not provide any sort of protective gear for long rides, besides the reflective material and which she had to pay for, no? And riding in a group calms her down, especially on the way back at night when there is more risk of accidents or possible assaults. She comments that she has had situations where a punctured tire has left her adrift at night in the middle of an order. So this group of colleagues can also offer help her to repair her bicycle. To finish my presentation briefly, the COVID experience for gig workers was a clear example of the idea of risk and how workers face risk during their activities. No, the laborers, for instance, were unprotected and face an unusual demand due to the quarantine and isolation that was recommended to the population to avoid contagion. A luxury they cannot afford. They were at the front line of the pandemic, no? Considering their labor activities has no recognition by the law and sometimes by the platforms, no? There has been different protests by food delivery workers denouncing the working conditions they face. They are demanding safety and dignity at work, and they're also trying to, again, fight back this sense of risk they experience daily. You know, they don't know how much money they will earn by the end of their activities, and they're exposed to different kind of accidents, etc. So to finish this presentation, there is important to think in terms of the methods we are using, for instance, through interviews or observation of workers' conditions, and to think with them this idea of risk that is not only physical, no, it's also psychological, in terms of they don't know what's going to happen when they are doing their activities, considering they have no protection from platforms, no. And also, in our case, we are exploring new ways to understand this idea of fairness. For instance, trying to collect, we are designing an app to collect data from workers in order to understand the time they spend working daily, the distance they the distance they, I don't know how to say, but how much time they spend going from point A to B, and because it is always frequent, they estimate in a wrong way the time they spend in the car or riding a bike, doing their work. They always consider sometimes they spend more time doing their activities, or they spend less time. They have no clear idea about how much money they are earning daily, etc., etc. So we are exploring new methods to understand this idea of fairness and risk, specifically in relation to workers' imaginaries of fairness, how they imagine it's a fair work, no, a fair condition, considering they celebrate this possibility to receive money easily through this activity, and they have low barriers to enter this market. So this is the way we are exploring fairness and trying to improve workers' conditions in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo, for that introduction. And finally, last but not least, I give the floor to Henry Chavez, who is going to discuss fair pay principle in the context of Ecuador. Thank you, Henry. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Funda, and thank you everyone and the organizer for inviting us to this really interesting winter school. Well, the first Fairwork principle is fair pay. It aims to know if the platforms pay at least a living wage to their workers. It could seem, or we can expect that this principle is easy to measure, or a straightforward principle, but actually what we found in our research in Ecuador when we made the first evaluation of the Fairwork principles is that it's not so. So in the last version of the principles, the Fairwork principles, there are, like the other principles, two thresholds. The first one is if the worker gain at least the legal minimum wage in the place where he or she works. And the second threshold is if the platform pays at least the local living wage after cost. Why I insist in the fact that this is the last version, because this is a living process and Fairwork principles are not written in stone, so they're changing, evolving with the feedback we get from every country and the research we're doing in every country. And last year, this principle changed. When we start the research in Ecuador, the first threshold was just aiming to measure if the platforms were paying the legal minimum wage, and the second threshold was aiming to measure if they were paying the minimal legal wage after cost. So now this principle has been updated to take into account one of the four things that we found in our research. The first was precisely this difference between the legal minimum wage and the living wage in a country. This probably in European context cannot be easily understood, but in countries like Latin America, where there are this difference between how much legally a company has to pay to the workers, and there is a huge difference between this and what actually people need to live monthly. This is the case in Ecuador, for example. The legal minimum wage is $400 more or less, but the actual living cost is around $800, so it's the double of that. So following the methodology from 2018, just two companies were paying legal minimum wage without taking into account cost. And just one of them was actually paying more if we take into account the cost. So with this update of the principle, there was probably just one of these platforms that would reach this point and not the other ones, because most of them didn't pay the actual living cost in Ecuador. So this is important, this updating, because I think it will let countries like Latin America and I guess other countries from the South to take into account this difference that is really contextualized in every country how much you actually need to live, and to reflect better the actual conditions the workers are having there. A second aspect that we found in our research and that should be discussed, I guess, in this winter school, is a phenomenon that we found also in other countries in Latin America, that is the subcontracting of the platforms accounts. The problem of migration in these countries is that most of these workers doesn't have papers, legal papers to get a license to drive the cars or the bikes. So they are obliged to sublet the accounts to someone that actually can register himself in the platform or has the motorbike or the car in order to work for the platform. which means that these workers are paying to these people, like intermediaries, to actually be allowed to work for the platform. It introduced an extra cost to the worker, which is not measured with the actual methodology we're using, because if platform provide us with data of how much they are paying to their workers, we will see just how much they are paying to the actual owner of the account, but we don't know how much they are charging the workers for the account and for the motorbike or the car they are using. So this can also introduce a problematic a problem in the measurement of this principle. A third aspect that I think it should be taken into account, and Pablo already talked about a little bit about this, is how the workers calculate their cost. As the principle is stated now, we will take into account costs for the first and the second threshold. It means if after the minimal legal wage, we take into account cost and we see if they are actually gaining that salary, or if it's taking into account the cost, the salary they gain from the platforms, it will be more than the living cost in their countries or in the city where they are. So the problem is that workers don't really know how to take into account the cost, not always, or not all the costs that they should take into account. So I think there is a lot of work to do there, because, for example, if platforms doesn't include an insurance or the cost of social security, these costs are not are transferred to the workers, and we are not taking into account this, because we are taking into account just how much they pay for fuel or for the reparations of the vehicles or the time they are spending waiting for a new order. But the way this platform works introduces a lot of problems to make the actual calculations of how much they are really gaining and paying for doing this kind of job. So I think there are also a lot of things to think about there. And the final aspect that we found, I think it demands a little bit of more thinking on how we can actually measure this, is the problems introduced by the algorithmic management of these platforms that are not present in normal works. What I mean by this, since these workers are not in an actual place working, they are always moving around, they have their own vehicles, they have this let's say, times that they are not actually doing any delivery or taking somebody somewhere, but they're just waiting for an order, or they have to move from one place to another to take the client or to take the product they will deliver. So the platform allocates orders or clients to these workers in function of these algorithms that we don't know how they work. They are very opaque. And a person who works the same time that another one can actually finishing not gaining the same amount of money, which in a normal work, if you work 1 hour, you will receive a payment for this hour. With these algorithmic techniques of management, we are not always sure that the same time will be paid the same amount of money, because depending on when you're working, you get some stars, or you are punished because you did a delivery late, or you didn't say good morning to the client. Any of these little aspects of the algorithmic management can impact the actual rate that a worker has, and this will impact the actual gaining they will have for the platform, even if they work the same time. So there are a lot of nuances that has to take we have to take into account in the measurement of this principle. I think that's for my part, Funda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry, for that introduction. And you opened up many questions, actually, for us to follow up on. Before we go to our second session, which is going to be opening the floor to all our panelists tonight and receiving some questions from you, from the audience. And rather than specifically principle by principle, we will discuss general questions you might have about Fairwork and how it works in different countries, as well as our research findings. We have already received one question, so I will first ask the organizer of the event to bring all our panelists to the screen. Yes, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. So the first question we received tonight is regarding workers' participation in organized labor. How much of a role plays the fact that many people are on temporary working visas? Does that hinder their participation? Asks Nicolas Palacios from YouTube. If it's okay, I will go with, I will start with Mounika again and go in the order where everyone presented. And please feel free to feed into the question, which I'm sure you have all experienced, the relationship between migration and gig labor in your own countries and in your own contexts. So Mounika, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for this question. I think in India, if you look at migration patterns, they aren't international. They're more domestic, and they usually tend to be from rural to urban areas. So I think there tends to be a lot of movement from other parts of, say, Karnataka towards Bangalore, which is a more cosmopolitan city, and you see these platforms operating on a large scale over here. But that said, so I think the part about temporary visa may not be particularly applicable here in this context. But that said, there are still, we do see a feeling of belonging. So you'd have to belong to a particular state, or you have to belong to a particular gender. I think that is very important. Women don't get to be a part of these groups. Women don't get to be part of these informal networks or formal networks that tend to, participate in these in strikes or basically help each other out. So they're not a part of this brotherhood that a lot of these gig workers tend to form amongst themselves. So there are certain factors, regionality and gender being some of them, that do hinder participation in both formal and informal forms of networking and collectivization among gig workers in the context of India.
Thank you, Mounika. Oğuz, would you like to also go next?
Sure. This question is actually quite relevant for the German context and within the context of the principle fair management and the appeals processes. There is I cannot put a number exactly, but a lot of the workers that I've done interviews with, and a lot of the workers that I've socialized with, especially in the delivery platforms, so these could be grocery deliveries, food deliveries, are coming here, as also those that are in domestic care and domestic work platforms. They are coming from various different countries. Many of them are also coming with through working holiday visas. So a working holiday visa grants you a year to stay in a European country, and Germany is an attractive destination for a lot of immigrants, a lot of expats that are coming here. And it's relevant because of a number of different reasons. First of all, you are coming into a country whose legal framework you are not really familiar with. Even if you speak German, it's still a lot of legalese, as we would call it, a lot of things that are really hard to breach and understand. And it's, of course, unions and works councils' jobs, and works councils are still in the platform economy, are still quite a novel thing. And unions are also just getting into this this fight and trying to join forces with some of the platform workers. But it's their responsibility, as well as, of course, the management's responsibility, to be able to provide the workers with their rights, with their documents, or just it could be a training session, it could be a YouTube video where they are told that these are your rights. You have a right to appeal. You have these channels if things go wrong. You have these ways through which you can reach us. It's your legal right to do that. If you're not getting paid properly or on time, or if you're being deactivated for no reason, these are the channels through which you can reach us. But being an immigrant in a country like Germany and working for a platform which is already quite a precarious form of economy here, and oftentimes as an immigrant, this could be, you may also be studying part-time, and this could be a part-time job that you want to make some money on the side. It really becomes harder to, first of all, know the legal context through which you can contact or through which you can appeal. And second, also to have the willingness to appeal. Because if you're on a one-year visa here, and if what's in your head is to make as much money as possible and leave and go back to the country that you came from, then you don't bother dealing with going through the appeals process, which can last months. As I mentioned, you can try to reach out the platform and the response can take too long or never come at all. And are you really willing to deal with the legal battles that follow that? As an immigrant, the answer that I usually get is no, I'm not willing to deal with that. So that becomes an issue in the context of appeals, definitely.
Thank you so much, Oğuz. Branka, would you like to have a comment?
I can only have a comment. Well, Serbia is a very similar environment as India, so there is no many workers coming from other countries yet. The things are changing, or situation has been changing in the last couple of months, but it is really too early to comment on these new developments. Anyhow, when it comes to unionization, our workers, despite the fact that they have rights and legal grounds for unionization if they're hired by intermediary agencies, they're not really interested in this sort of collective action. And we asked many times why. I mean, why you would not really seek your rights through this channel, through unions that are really relatively active here in Serbia. And the answer is that unions are kind of obsolete, old-fashioned bunch of guys, that they don't understand reality of new forms of work, that workers, couriers and let's say drivers are mainly interested in safety-related issues, and nothing else really interests them, because they really see this kind of engagement as temporary one. So no interest whatsoever in collective action when it comes to local workers, and when it comes to foreigners or foreign workforce, it is too early to say or to make any smart conclusion.
Thank you, Branka. I'll give the floor to Arturo and then to Henry, please. Thank you.
Well, in the Chilean case, we have so many migrants working in the gig economy, especially from Colombia and Venezuela, and there's a strange case of a kind of virtual circle, no, in terms of these workers found on platform work a possibility to get income, considering that sometimes they are not able to apply for visas, or they are not capable to become part of formal labor markets, no. And in some case happens the things that Henry described before in terms of subcontracts or sublettings of subrents of cars for people who wants to work on Uber, for instance, and this makes difficult their possibilities to organize as a group. No, some of the there are some cases, but that people participate in the groups and the kind of movement that are trying to fight for better conditions, but they are legal in the country. No, so that's also another kind of challenge for us to have access to that people and trying to include in our sample, for instance. It's not easy to get in touch with illegal workers. No, they are not open to participate in this kind of research, considering their struggling, no, and difficulties.
Henry, I think you're muted.
Sorry. So I think the Latin American case is different because the migrants are coming especially now from Venezuela and Colombia, and the region has different agreements between countries regarding visas and working permissions. So I think the answer, the question would not apply exactly to the Latin American context, but I think there is a interesting thing that is happening in Latin America now, is that it's actually this moving condition of migrants. That are a lot of people who, for example, came to Ecuador, they stay just for a few months or 6 months, or even a year, and they move south to Chile or Argentina. And it's these people who are actually behind the organization of the whole Latin American network that start making some protests the last year, because there are people who met in some of the points of the way they are migrating, or they knew from home, and they are doing these networks from all these countries, and this let happen this regional movement to appear in the region, and they are starting to fight for the rights of these workers. This is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We heard a range of answers actually to this question, and which actually touched upon various principles which we already discussed, and I thank all the speakers for that. We received a couple more questions, but being aware of the time, I'd like to read both questions and then go through all panelists again. But please feel free to just respond to the part that you think is more relevant to your context, so that we can finish in time. The first one is from Svitlana Yukimovic, and she's asking, are there many platforms globally that have received top score? Are there ones that have gone above and beyond? Which platforms exemplify the things we want to see in the evolution of platforms? And the second question is from Rafael Groman, and he's asking, what experiences do you have in engaging with policymakers in relation to fair work? What are the commonalities and differences between countries? So perhaps in this one round, we can again start with Henry and then go the other way around this time, if that's okay, Henry.
Okay.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Okay, I'm correct. Well, in Ecuador, there is no platform that's doing things right, so I cannot say too much for the first question. The second one, we are starting talking with some policymakers now to try to involve them in the discussions of the next evaluation we will do this year, and also to put them in contact with the workers so they can know the problems they are facing with the platforms. But this is a process that we are just starting, so I cannot say too much now of the results that we will get of this. Thank you.
Arturo? No comment, Arturo? That's also completely fine as well. We can't hear you though.
No, I don't have nothing to say about it, honestly.
That's completely fine. That's completely fine. Oğuz, Mounika, or Branka, does any of you want to have a comment?
I could jump in
Please do.
if it's my, I don't know if it's my turn, but I guess there's no turn anymore. We're just jumping into the conversation. So in terms of best practice platforms, we have a couple of them in Germany, but I am afraid they're not globally active platforms. They're more Germany specific. And we highlighted some of them in last year's report. I don't want to give any spoilers for this year's report and scoring because we are also in the process of scoring and evaluating the platforms this year. But I can tell you that there are still going to be some platforms that are going to be doing a better job, but there are also going to be some surprises on platforms, I presume, that we're going to see that are new in the market and that are not going to be highlighted for their best practices, sadly. But it's once again our responsibility to make sure that we point them out, and we also keep in communication with the managers regarding better practices. But with regards to policymakers, I just wanted to add two things that I myself, through this research, have learned in the case of Germany. Two things that workers themselves are crying out loud for and demanding from policymakers, and us as Fairwork can only, as researchers, highlight and try to reach out to policymakers to remind them, because they already know these. That's the problem, to remind them once again. And this is once again a call out to the new coalition government that's going to be coming into Germany in a couple of months. Two things. First one is the probation period of 6 months Probezeit. Unacceptable. It has to change. Second is laws regarding collective action in this country. And I myself, coming to this country from the US and then before that in Turkey, am surprised that the laws for collective action are so outdated, are so based in the 50s and 60s, that union busting is still a legit thing in this country, that many of the platforms they can use these legal loopholes to deal with collective action, to deal with works councils, and to deal with union pressure, that these things have to change. And it's once again, as researchers in Germany, are responsible to remind the politicians that these 2 points have to change immediately.
Thank you. Mounika, Branka, any comments from you?
Sure, I can jump in maybe about the first question. I think last year we've had Urban Company, which is an Indian platform, but has also sort of expanded its operations to a couple of other countries internationally recently, score about 8 of 10 on our last year's scores. And they've had a couple of good practices that we were able to highlight in our report last year. But with the evolving principles, and with the kind of feedback that we take from different stakeholders and build on that to evolve the principles according, and to make sure they reflect what workers really want and need. The goalposts are moving, and it's just we'll have to see in the upcoming report about how well they do, and how, if they fall, if they don't. It goes for all platforms in India. I don't have any comment about the policymakers.
No problem, and thank you so much for your input. On that note, I would like to close our panel for tonight and thank all the panelists, all our speakers, for their inputs and for their generous contributions. I'll give the floor back to Mira, the organizer of the session tonight, and she has a couple of announcements to make. And thank you again for listening and for tuning in tonight.
Thank you so much, Funda, and also thank you from my side to all the speakers for the very interesting inputs and global perspectives tonight. And also thank you for both the audience here at TU Berlin, but also our audience on YouTube for listening tonight. And I would just like to briefly announce the upcoming talks. As I said earlier, this is a talk series of 3 events. So tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we will have an event titled Moving Towards Regulation, Analyzing Current Challenges, Platforms, Responses, and Future Strategies. So we will talk about how new policy efforts to regulate the platform economy can be interpreted, and how can we ensure that these new regulation truly benefits gig workers. And this will be a keynote held by Johanna Wenkebach. She's a legal scholar and scientific director of the Hugo Sinsheimer Institute for Labor and Social Security Law here in Germany. So please be here. You're welcome tomorrow at 7. And then on Thursday night, also at 7, we have another panel titled Interventions for a Different Platform Economy. So we will discuss what can be learned from worker-led protests, strikes, and collective actions of gig workers for decent pay and working conditions that challenge platform companies in the last few years. And we will have 3 speakers from the Gorillas Workers Collectives, the Tech Worker Coalition, and the Fairwork Foundation. And we will discuss the wildcat strikes of delivery riders in Berlin, and also strategies to build alliances and solidarity with and between tech workers. And with that, I wish all of you a very nice evening and hope to see you tomorrow.